A reading from the second chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 13 to 22. As the Jewish Passover was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple precincts, he came upon people engaged in selling oxen, sheep, and doves, and others seated changing coins. He made a kind of whip of cords and drove sheep and oxen alike out of the temple area, and knocked over the money changers' tables, spilling their coins. He told those who were selling doves, "Get them out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." His disciples recalled the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house consumes me." At this, the Jews responded, "What sign can you show us authorizing you to do these things?" "Destroy this temple," was Jesus' answer, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." They retorted, "This temple took 46 years to build, and you are going to raise it up in 3 days? Actually, he was talking about the temple of his body. Only after Jesus had been raised from the dead did his disciples recall that he had said this, and come to believe the Scripture and the word he had spoken.
This is a time in our conference when we try to respond to some of the normal questions that people have regarding Christian nonviolence, the normal problems that they have. And so we'll just take questions from people as they occur to them, and Donna will read them for the sake of being able to record the answers consistently and orderly.
Father, someone asked, what about the cleansing of the temple when Jesus whipped the money changers out of the temple? Doesn't this story justify violence?
The cleansing of the temple, for perhaps 95% of the Christians in the pew on Sunday, is the piece of Scripture that they use to justify the use of violence from infanticide to atomic war. In responding to the question, I think it's worth a serious amount of effort, even though, let me say from the beginning, there is no possible way that that passage can be used to justify violence. But a detailed response seems to be important on the basis that so many Christians employ it as their justification for using violence. The first thing that has to be remembered is that this story existed from the beginning. People knew the events and they knew the story. And yet, in the original form of Christianity, whether one wants to argue that was 175 years at least, or 300 years at most, in the original form of Christianity, this story was known, and it was never employed to justify violence of any kind. And in the original form of Christianity, those people that lived it actually spoke the language that the gospel is written in, Koine Greek. Koine Greek is now a dead language. But they lived it and they spoke this common form of Greek. And none of them ever thought of using the cleansing of the temple to justify violence, even in the face of severe persecution and death. So right from the beginning, there should be some question raised in people's minds who do not speak the language, who are not dealing with a living language, indeed may not know Greek at all. that something is askew when they're reading this story to justify violence. Second point. Let us assume that we want to be fundamentalist. Let us assume that we want to take the gospel as history in the sense that someone was following Jesus around, more or less, writing out what he was doing. Now, there are tremendous problems in doing this, because what you have is, you have internal contradictions in the gospel where Jesus is saying one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and vice versa in another gospel. But be that as it may. The one thing that we have to be clear about is that if one is going to be a fundamentalist, there is only one way to be a fundamentalist, and that is you have to be a fundamentalist in Koine Greek. For once you pass out of Koine Greek into any other language in the world, you are no longer a fundamentalist. You are dealing with intricate problems of translation of languages that are cultural, that are living languages in different places and different times. No two languages fit consistently one on top of the other. And therefore, there are problems of translation, transliteration, interpretation, meaning of cliches, forms, literary forms of the language and so forth, if one is going from Koine Greek to Spanish or Koine Greek to English or whatever the case may be. So if one wants to be a fundamentalist, one has to be a fundamentalist in the Greek of the New Testament. And it is absolutely unequivocally for certain, in the New Testament, Jesus never strikes a human being in the temple, nor any place else in the Gospels. Never. It is absolutely clear that what is being struck in the temple with the whip, if anything, is the animals. The whip only occurs in the Gospel of John. Only in the Gospel of John. And in the modern translations, at least into English, it is very, very clear that the whip is being directed at the animals in order to be consistent with what the Greek says. Therefore, at the level of fundamentalist, that is, the one that says, Jesus did it, therefore we can do it this way, the best that can be said is, Christians can strike animals. Period. To make the jump from the animal to the human is not legitimate. And if you want to say Christians can strike animals, fine, but we know what you move animals with a cord. It's not the same thing as when you're slashing out at a human being with a cord. That's it. There is no striking by Jesus of a human being in the gospel, let alone killing. In the first centuries of Christianity, understood this completely. He spoke the language. There was no question. So why is it that 95% of the Christians in the pew today take this piece and use it to justify violence? Well, first of all, let's ask what the piece means, huh? Let's ask what the piece means. What does it literally mean? In order to understand what a piece of writing means literally, you have to know two things, basically. You have to know the content of the writing. That is, if the writing talks about a bear, the animal a bear, you have to know what a bear is. You can't work if you don't know what B-E-A-R is. But you also have to know something else to understand any piece of writing on the face of the earth. You have to know the form of the piece of literature in front of you. Otherwise, it's not understandable. When a language is actually a living, spoken, written language, we know the forms automatically just by living in the culture. We don't even think about it. But if you don't know the form, then there is serious trouble. For example, if I tell you a story that's a fairy tale, the sole purpose of which is to communicate moral truth, say you shouldn't lie, and you don't understand that I'm using the form of fairy tale, and you think that I'm using the form of historical communication, we're in trouble. I tell you a story about three bears, and they talk to each other, and one does this, and one says this, and one says this, and one lies here, and one lies there, another lies, and then there's chaos. The moral of the story is don't lie. And 2 days later, I'm walking down the street, and you see me go by, and you're talking to a friend, and you say, there goes that priest that thinks bears talk. And I hear you, and I say, what? What do you mean I think bears talk? I don't think bears talk. You say, oh yeah, you said it on the retreat last weekend. You said bears talk. I said, when did I say bears talk? That story about the three bears, they were talking to each other, and that bear lied, and this bear lied. I said, yeah, but I didn't mean bears talk. Well, you said bears talk. I said, yeah, but I didn't mean bears talk. And you say, well, did you or didn't you say bears talk? Well, I said, yeah, but you see what's happening? I'm not, when I say bears talk, this bear says that and that bear says, I'm not lying to you, because we all understand the literary form of fairy tale, as a way of communicating moral truth or that sort of thing. There's no question whatsoever that we're dealing with a form that's anything other than that, that we're dealing with history, that I don't really mean bears talk. But that is what happens when you do not know the forms of the living language. Koine Greek is a dead language. Every attempt is made to communicate the forms correctly, but no two languages come right down on top of each other. The cleansing of the temple is a particular literary form. Since the cleansing of the temple appears in all four Gospels, it's only the Gospel of John that has the whip, by the way, there is obviously an historical reality in back of it, where Jesus had this serious confrontation with the powers of the temple. But let's ask what the form is trying to communicate. What is trying to be communicated is this: Jesus' total and absolute authority over the temple, and therefore over Judaism. He is the Messiah. So let me give you some background. Who are the money changers? The famous money changers were employees of the high priest of the temple. You see, Jewish people could not use Roman coins because Roman coins had the picture of Caesar on them as God. And this was idolatry for the Jews. Now, all kinds of people did it. Now, when they came to the temple for the Passover, as it says, they had to have their animal for sacrifice. But they could not buy the animals with Roman coins because this was idolatry. And the thought of using an idolatrous coin to buy a sacrifice was impossible to them. So the high priest set up a business, kind of like a Bureau of Exchange, where he would take the Roman coins himself with Caesar's picture on it as God, and he would give back shekels to the Jews. Of course, he would make a profit on this. Then they would take the shekels and they would buy the animals for sacrifice, which was also the business of the high priest. It is in this context, to this context, that Jesus comes. Now, at the time in the temple at the Passover, there would have been tens of thousands of people, animals all over the place, and so forth and so on. There is no possibility that Jesus was tearing into tens of thousands of people, hundreds and perhaps thousands of money changers and dealers in animals for the high priest. What is absolutely for certain is that the story is a form that communicates an awesomely powerful symbolic event in the life of Jesus that everyone understood instantly. What we fail to understand is human beings are creatures of symbol. Get the right symbol and you can move the world. It's difficult to get the right symbol. That is the symbol that people will react to, who will understand intuitively what's being said in the situation. But if you can find it, its power is awesome. Let me give you an example. Back in the late 1960s, when the United States was tearing Vietnam apart, this little land 7,500 miles away that no one even knew the name of it before the war started, let alone a city in it. And death and misery were being executed all over the place. In the United States, the horror of the war was symbolized by napalm, which was being used extensively in that part of the world, because napalm just didn't kill. For the purpose of war is just not to kill. The purpose of war is to maim and cause suffering and mental anguish also. All kinds of anguish to defeat the enemy. And so Father Daniel Berrigan had gone to Vietnam, and he had saw some of these bombings. And he had actually seen little children burned to death with napalm. And he came home and he started talking about Vietnam as the land of the burning children. Now this is at a time when you had about 95% of the Catholic population and the Christian population, Orthodox and Protestants also, utterly behind the war. And if they weren't behind it, they were utterly indifferent to what was going on. And so the question became, how do you communicate the drastic evil that's taking place here? And so what he and 8 other people did, 9 people did one evening, in full view of the press and everything else, they went to a little Maryland town called Catonsville, and they went into a draft office, where they conscripted, had the files for conscripting people for the war. And they took a box of these files out, and they put the files out, and there was pictures and everything else there, and they put the files out, and they napalmed the files. And then they, of course, this is a federal crime, and they were arrested and so forth and so on. But all over the United States, the symbol was powerful and clear. So what they were saying in their statement and by their action is, you who are napalming children, how dare you arrest us for napalming paper? They proceeded, that symbol was so powerful, they were on the front of Time magazine, and so it caught. And in some very serious way, it began to make people think about the terrible evil that was being done. Now there was absolutely no desire and intention whatsoever to burn all 20 million draft files in the United States. That wasn't the purpose at all. When Dan and Phil and Tom Lewis and Brother David Das did this, it was symbol, realizing how powerful symbol is. And that's what Jesus was doing in the cleansing of the temple. In the New Testament, says Father John L. McKenzie, one of the leading biblical scholars in the Catholic Church, he says, Jesus lists no greater impediment to the attainment of the kingdom of God than wealth. Universally, over and over and over again in human history, people have manipulated the poor and the unfortunate, have indeed kept God away from God's people by making religion a business. And this is what the high priest had done, Caiaphas, at the time of Jesus. Because the high priest was the high priest, and he was the one that was in charge of everything, and no one would dare flaunt his authority in Israel. So when someone walks in, and they knock over the high priest tables, and they let the animals of the high priest go, and they say, my Father's house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. And that someone is Jesus, because he obviously had a place in Jewish consciousness at that time. The power of the symbol obviously was communicated to the high priest and to the people. For he was stating he had superior authority. Not only that, he was stating that what was being done with the religion of Yahweh by these people was evil. There is no question that the form communicates a symbolic gesture by Jesus that speaks both about the distortion of religion that takes place when religion becomes business, and wealth as an impediment to reaching God. I often remember, and this is a true story, in the 5th grade, Sister Consolata in the 5th grade. In those days back in Boston, when you went into the church, you paid as you walked in the door, called it seat money. And you'd give the man $1 and he'd give you 75 cents back. It was a quarter, I guess, And you paid. So one Sunday, it's the 5th grade, I remember listening to the gospel about Jesus and the money changers in the temple. And I went into class the next morning, and when it came to the religion part of the class, I raised my hand, and I said to Sister Consolata, I said, Sister, yesterday's gospel was about the cleansing of money changers in the temple. Now, I saw people changing money in the back of the church. Why don't we get rid of them? Isn't that what Jesus wants? And she said, you don't understand. And I still don't. You see, we are dealing here with a serious spiritual problem. There is no justification of violence. But what there is a direct avoidance of what Jesus was cleansing the temple of by precisely the people who should be looking at it. He was cleansing it of all the motivations and all of the kinds of dynamics that are tied to money that are contrary to the will of God. Now, let's be clear. We're spending the time on this because this has become the major excuse Christians use for justifying violence. What is the power that's being communicated there by Jesus? It's a symbolic power. A symbolic power. But power. Let me give you an example of what that literary form communicates. Back in America, I don't know if you have it here, but back in America, people don't give to the church anymore like they used to. They used to give out of faith, and because they wanted the faith to be preserved and they wanted to be passed on and so forth and so on. So since they've stopped giving for whatever reasons that has occurred, what the churches have set up is bingo, a gambling device. Now this is not, and it's not just the Catholic churches, Protestant, Orthodox, even the synagogues have it today. Now what this is a gambling device. And it's not, bingo for a little group of, say, senior citizens who come in, and they, 15 or 20 men and women come down on Tuesday night and play. Oh no, this is big prizes. This is big money, going into the thousands and thousands of dollars at night. Some parishes running them 2 and 3 nights a week. Busloads of people coming in. Some places in Massachusetts, they come across the border from New Hampshire to come down because the prizes are so good. This is playing on greed. That's what it's playing on. Well, now suppose you had an entrepreneurial pastor, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. And the pastor one day, for ecumenical etiquette, since I'm a Catholic, let's say it's a Catholic pastor. And this pastor decides that he's not making enough money with bingo. As a matter of fact, he decides, well, greed is one of the 7 capital sins. So if I can use greed as a way of getting the money to proclaim the gospel against greed, which is what it is, then by golly, why can't I just find a better capital sin that makes more money to proclaim the gospel against it? And he thinks about it and he says, all right, what I'll do is I'll use lust as a way of making money to proclaim the gospel against lust. So what he does is he sets up in the back of his church a pornography shop. You know? I mean, lust is every bit as damaging as greed, but greed is every bit as damaging as lust, etc., etc. And so he sets up this pornography shop in the back of the church. And lo and behold, after Mass on Sunday, all the Christians go in there and they buy the books and they look at the books, And he's making a fortune. And he's brought some beautiful statues from Italy for the church, and he's refurbished the school, and the kids have the latest religious ed equipment and everything. It's going beautiful, Every room has a VHS for the kids to learn their math and their religion on, and everything's going great guns, And the place is packed, In fact, attendance is up. And then one Sunday, for some strange reason these things happen, one Sunday, Mother Teresa goes to Mass there. And on her way out, she sees this and she looks at it. And she walks over. She looks at what's going on. And she reaches up and she picks a handful of these books off the shelf and throws them on the floor. Reaches over on a table and knocks 3 or 4 of them on the ground. The communication is total. Absolutely total. And she can't be touched because it's Mother Teresa. There is no question about what's going on. The wrong of it, the evil of it, the inconsistency with the gospel, and not a word is spoken. It's not a justification of violence. It's a presentation and a cleansing of the temple of the power of God. And that's what Mother Teresa would be expressing in that situation. It would not be, how can you justify violence from picking a few books off the shelf and throwing them on the floor, knocking over a table, or pushing 2 or 3 of thousands of animals out of a gate with? Has nothing to do with that at all. And yet this has become the single greatest justifier, contrary to what's on the pages of the gospel, of violence in Christianity. And priests and ministers and bishops, universally, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, continue to let it go like that without correcting it from childhood on forward. We could ask how it became this, quite frankly. Father John L. McKenzie, talking about how this developed in religious consciousness, uses this kind of approach to it to try to explain it. He says, if we think about it, everyone thinks they know the story of the Exodus. But how many people have actually read the story of the Exodus? And yet everyone thinks they know the story of the Exodus. He says everyone thinks they know the story of the Exodus because everyone has seen 5, 10, or 15, or 20 times Cecil B. DeMille's picture, The 10 Commandments. They haven't read Scripture, but they've seen the movie. And so, lo and behold, they assume that they know the Exodus. They see Charlton Heston walk down to the edge of the banks of the Red Sea with his Moses, that is, walk down to the banks of the Red Sea with his staff, and he puts the staff out, and the waves go up 40 or 50 feet on each side, and so forth and so on. As Father McKenzie says, you know, within the document, that's just not there. But everyone thinks it is there because they've watched Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, and they haven't read the document. So McKenzie says, after a while, if you watch that enough, it slowly becomes part of your consciousness, and you simply look at it and say to yourself, well, must be that way because what Cecil B. DeMille could do, God could do. In other words, the cleansing of the temple is in Christian consciousness as a justification of violence, not because of what's on the pages of the gospel. It's impossible, for Jesus strikes no one. The cleansing of the temple starts as it does in Renaissance consciousness. It's imbuing itself as a justification of violence because of Renaissance art. People that did not know Scripture, did not know Greek, were painting outside the church, that is, with no community that was helping them to discern, and painting so-called Christian art. If you take one of the great Renaissance artists, El Greco, you take a look at his cleansing of the temple. Mind you, on the pages of the gospel, Jesus does not strike a human being, only animals at most. And in El Greco's cleansing of the temple, there is not an animal in it. All there is human beings, and Jesus is flailing at them with a whip. But this is how people learn their religion, by looking at the art. And even in our own time, I happened to turn the television on one day, and right at the cleansing of the temple, a movie by Fulton Oswald, Fulton Oswald's book, The Greatest Story Ever Told. And here it was, right at the cleansing of the temple, and Jesus was conducting himself like a Hercules. It's not the power of Hercules that's being communicated there. It's the power that's represented by Mother Teresa in that incident that I told you. The power that's represented in that symbolic draft file burning. It's the power of truth, if need be, crucified truth, coming through a person and making a clear and unequivocal statement. There is no justification for violence that can be gotten through the cleansing of the temple. And those Christians in the early centuries of Christianity, for whom Koine Greek was a living language, never employed the cleansing of the temple to try to justify violence, even under the crisis situation of persecution.
Someone else has asked, what if someone comes into your house and is going to kill your wife and children? Should you do nothing?
Should you do nothing if someone is going to do evil to you or to those that you love? This is a normal kind of question that comes consistently. The what would you do if question. There are a number of assumptions to it, and the first one we have to get over right away. And that is that Christian nonviolence means doing nothing. Jesus' whole life is active resistance against evil, in the way that he believes evil, in the only way that evil can be overcome, by the power that he represents. He is not doing nothing. When we say that Jesus' way is doing nothing, what that means is we have reached the point in our spiritual and our human consciousness that what we're saying is, if we do not have the power of violence, we have no power. And that's just wrong from all that we talked about in the previous conferences. Jesus does not call the Christian to stand by and let evil run rampant across the world. That is absolutely clear. The Christian, the one who is baptized into Christ, is committed to actively confronting evil, but confronting it with the power of Christ, the power of God, the power of love, in a different way than others confront evil. And so the question, what would you do if, or what would I do if someone came in and was going to kill my wife and children and so forth, and I could kill them, or they could kill, or they would kill, what would I do? Would I kill them or not? Well, my glib answer to the question is, if someone's going to come in and kill you or your wife or children, of course, if you're a Christian, you'd do just what Jesus would do. You'd blow his head off. The answer is absurd. It doesn't even fit right. Huh? The fact of the matter is this. Isn't it interesting that when the question is asked, it's always asked in terms, well, what would I do if someone came in to kill my wife or my children? You see, people are killing other people's wives and children right now, and we don't care. Look at the misery that the people in the United States and Western Europe are prosecuting on top of the third world through their greed in their governments and their silence. Look at the misery, the children who are being killed today by policies made in Moscow and made in London and made in Washington. And no one cares about those children. So the critical thing is, what if my children, my wife, my husband, or whatever? So the first thing we got to get clear is that we're not interested in defending others, we're interested in defending what we love, an extension of self. There's nothing wrong with this, but we got to look at the context of the question. It's not as altruistic as it seems. But be that as it may, the reality of the matter is that the situation does occur in human life, the crisis situation, where the choice is violence or nonviolence. And the question becomes, what would I do if? Well, the first thing we got to realize is this. It makes no difference what I do in terms of what the gospel says. I can go out and kill. I can go out and steal and rob and rape. Makes no difference. The gospel is still the gospel. Truth is still truth. Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love, whether I execute them or not. I know that there's a way that people have of getting around the gospel by saying about the priest and minister, he doesn't practice what he preaches. But the priest is not ordained to preach what he practices. The priest is ordained to preach the gospel. The real danger is that the priest or the minister or the bishop stops preaching the gospel and starts preaching its modification in order to meet his or her own practice. Then we've got trouble. It takes a courageous priest or a courageous minister, a courageous bishop to say, this is the gospel, I'm not following it. Or a courageous layperson. So the first thing that we want to get straight is, regardless of whether anyone follows it or not, the truth is the truth is the truth. Jesus teaches nonviolent love, and that is it. In terms of the particular situation, what would you do if someone came in and was going to kill you or your family, member of your family, and you could kill them? The question is always asked that way. What I'd like to communicate is this. That method of trying to understand how to live life is wrong. It's an illusion. It's no way to understand the teachings of Jesus to say, what if this, 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 and this? Now what would you do if you were a Christian? Why? Because in every human situation that we encounter, every single one, there are an infinite number of variables that are taking place. In any given 1 minute encounter with a human being, we could write a book of 10 or 20,000 pages describing the facts that were in that situation. As we look out, we take in the whole 180 degrees, and then through habits of thought, we selectively concentrate on a few. But we're taking in everything. What we concentrate on is not what's there, it's only a piece of what's there. This is of critical importance. Because when someone says, what if someone came into your house and was going to kill your wife and they had a gun and you could reach down and grab a gun and you could kill them, they are giving you a tiny little piece of what the fact situation was. They're giving you 5 or 10 or 100 variables out of hundreds of millions of variables in the situation that you can act with. I say that only as reality. Casualty as a way of doing ethics is invalid, at least as a way of doing Christian ethics. For it's the setting up of an illusionary world of a minimal number of facts that are only a small number in a whole panoply of facts, and then asking what would you do with them. Facts that every instant are changing. All right. I say that just to be clear that in order to be a Christian, one has to be a realist. Secondly, very, very important to get this straight, not only in terms of violence and nonviolence in the gospel, but for the whole life. People do not act in crisis situations, for the most part, any differently than they act day in and day out in common affairs. If day in and day out I am becoming conscious of and responding as a creature of selective perception, living out of a spirit, of revenge, retaliation, taking care of number one, being first, fear, whatever the case may be, if that's the way I live in common affairs, that's how I will live in the crisis situation when the pressure is put on. We are creatures of selective perception which we nurture. On the other hand, if day in and day out I have put on the mind of Christ, Abba, God is mercy, and I am constantly looking for openings to do mercy, to be kind, to be gentle, to return good for evil, then in the crisis situation there'll be a chance that I'll do that. For we develop what we see depending upon what our motivation is and what our habits that are built on that motivation is. For example, you find an exquisite soccer player, and you're looking at the game, you're even looking at it from above, and you'd say, how did he find that opening? How did he do that? Out of this whole perception of world that he's bringing into his sight and his mind, he has developed an intense awareness, a focused awareness on how to relate to reality in order to get that ball through on the different occasions. I don't do that, you can't do that, but that's his habit of consciousness. So also the habit of greed, the habit of fear, or the habit of mercy. As one can become an artist in terms of being a soccer ball player, one can be an artist in terms of greed. And one can be an artist in terms of fear, or lust, or mercy. And so, every time we come into a human situation, there are an infinite number of variables that we are encountering. The tendency is we will act as we have acted in the past. Out of the spirit that we've lived in the past, we'll live that now. That we'll find those variables that will go along with our prior nurturing, whether that be in terms of greed, whether that be in terms of lust, whether that be in terms of anger, whether that be in terms of mercy. We will find them and we'll use them. Let me give you a story to illustrate what I'm saying. A true story. One of the great Christians in American Christianity in the 20th century, a Baptist minister by the name of Clarence Jordan. Clarence Jordan, a Southerner who had a bachelor's degree in agriculture and a doctorate degree in Greek. He developed a unique style of writing. His whole life was dedicated to Christ's teachings of nonviolent love. In the 1940s, he decided that one of the great evils in the United States was racism. The setting people apart and treating them differently exclusively on the color of their skin, he felt was utterly inconsistent with loving as Christ loved. It was diabolical. And so he knew that the time had passed when another paper was needed to be written on it, or another book. And that the way Jesus confronted evil was he directly brought the power of love right up against the power of evil. And so Clarence Jordan, in the mid-1940s, went to southwest Georgia. And he set up a farm called Koinonia Farm, and he immediately integrated it. White people and black people working together. Black families and white families living in houses and working on the farm. All governed under the rule of Christ, and the understanding being that Christ's teachings were teachings of nonviolent love towards everybody, friend and enemy. Now in the mid-1940s, southwest Georgia was Nazi America, where race was concerned. People disappeared from the face of the earth and no one cared. Black people and their sympathizers. It was the world of that grotesque form of Christianity. There was the Ku Klux Klan. Probably no more grotesque than any of the major churches have been in their history, but grotesque nevertheless. And so this is where Clarence Jordan went with the love of Christ to confront the power of evil. He didn't just pray about it, he did it. If Christ is risen and the power of Christ is there, then this is where we take it to, right where the evil is. And you can imagine what happened at that point. There were burnings, there were bombings, there were beatings, huh? But the principle was always the same, huh? That one related as Christ would relate, not only to people outside the community, but to people internal to the community, husbands, wives, co-workers, and so forth. This was the life. This was the Christian life. And things went from bad to worse, as you can imagine, huh? The churches in Albany and around utterly disowned them. But somehow, the farm managed to survive. Somehow they got enough crops out, enough food, and so forth. And so what took place was that after about 8 years of this, huh, something happened that had never happened before. One Thursday night, I believe it was, about midnight, cars drove into the housing quarters of the farm, and they machine gunned the housing area, just missing the killing of children and everybody, huh? Arbitrarily machine gunned and drove away. And of course this created total terror, huh? Total terror. Out in the middle of nowhere, knowing that people want you dead and no one cares about you, they really wish you weren't there. Hated by the community, and now you're being machine gunned. And so Jordan went down the next morning, next day, to the churches in Albany and various places and told them what is happening. You know what they told them? You're going to get these people killed. Unless you get the blacks out of there, you're going to get these people killed. He hasn't pulled the trigger. He's living a nonviolent life, and he's going to get them killed. Nothing said about those that are machine gunning. And of course, he knew then, and the community knew, they were alone. The next Thursday night, about midnight, soon after, the same thing happened again. And now we're dealing with total terror. Because now it's clear that they're alone, that the people doing the machine gunning know they're alone, and there's no reason anyone isn't killed, because it was just arbitrary spraying of houses. I believe it went on one more week, and all the questions that any one of us would imagine had occurred there. Has the experiment gone far enough? Have we gone as far as we can for this time? Should we back out, save lives? All the questions that one can imagine when that sort of thing occurs. Questions motivated by honest love, questions motivated by fear. Yet everyone has to live with each other and live with the outside world as Christ would live, even under this crisis situation. And Jordan was just very, very serious about the fact that no, we cannot move. This is evil, and the power of the resurrection, the power of the love of Christ, is what confronts this. He has all these people he's responsible for. So the fourth Thursday night, I believe, fourth Thursday afternoon, actually, late in the afternoon, 3 white men come up to the farm. They want to see Jordan. They're Southerners, he's a Southerner. They come up. They tell him all the things that happened the 3 previous Thursday nights, details that they couldn't possibly know unless they were there. They did it. They were part of it. And so they tell him, unless you get the blacks off of here, now the sun isn't going to come up on this place tomorrow morning. We've given you your warning. We know that no one in this community wants you here, and you know it. With all the vulgarity and everything else that with toughness and meanness that went with this. And so they told them straight up, you get the black people off here now, or the sun isn't going to rise on this place tomorrow morning. And Jordan said, boys, he said, they told me in seminary there were boys like you on the face of the earth, but I never believed it. He said, fellas, he said, they told me in seminary there were even Christian boys like you that lived. He said, I'd never believed it. They told me in seminary, fellas, he said, that there were boys like you that were even, he said, someday I could meet. But I never believed that such a moment would occur, that I'd be in this position, having to be with fellas like you, he said. He said, boys, he said, let me shake your hand. He said, I want to shake the hand, he said, of 3 fellas that can make the sun stand still. He was a Southerner, they were a Southerner. They were Southerners. There was just a little bit of humor. He noticed the wedding ring on one of their fingers, and he said, asked him, was he married? He said, yeah, children, yeah. He said, you know what it's like when you have a baby, he said, that's up all night and you got to go to work? Oh, geez, the guy says you don't feel good the next day at all. You're mad at everybody and don't feel good. And he says, you know, if that baby's up 2-3 nights awake, he says, you know what it is? He said, oh, yeah, it's terrible. He said, you're crazy. And you're trying to get some sleep, you can't sleep, you know. And he said, you know, if that goes on a long time, he said, that's not a nice life, is it? No, it isn't. He says, you know, any time in that kind of life, he said, that would happen, he said, and you could get an hour's sleep, he said, you're happy for an hour or 2 sleep in the middle of when a baby's sick like that. Oh, of course, yes. Huh? He said, well, look, fellas, he said, we got a family here that has a little baby. The little baby, he said, doesn't seem to get better. You know, it seems to get better, and then it goes back, he said. He said, the mommy and the daddy, he said, they're up 3 nights in a row. Then the baby's fine for 2 nights. Then it's up 2 more nights, and then they're up 2 more nights, and then 3 nights. And it's been going on this way for months. That's a terrible situation, isn't it? He said, they got to go out and work the next day. I said, yeah, that's terrible. Well, he said, look, fellas, he said, when you come through here, he said, and you machine gun these places, he said, you wake that baby up for sure. What do you want to do that for? There was no massacre that night. There was no machine gunning that night. There was never any machine gunning again. The misery and the other difficulties didn't stop, but that did. Which one of us, out of all the variables in that situation, would have picked the little phrase, make the sun stand still? And out of all the millions of variables in that situation, would have picked the wedding ring on the finger and creatively worked with it to reconcile? That power comes from being faithful in little things. That comes from a 24-hour-a-day commitment to love as Christ loved, to bring Christ's peace through Christ's nonviolent love into the littlest situation. And then one begins to develop the eye like the soccer player for the openings for mercy and reconciliation and peace. Which one of us, if that happened and they came up to the farm, we'd say, grab them, hold them, get the license plate number, call the police. If we wouldn't have been gone long before that in terms of the confrontation with evil and our certainty, huh? that this is what Christ called us to do, the direct confrontation of the power of love with the power of evil. But Jordan had nurtured a consciousness, mercy, compassion, nonviolent love of Jesus in the littlest things in life. And therefore, because he nurtured it in common affairs, he had something to call on in the crisis moments. It is not that we may not have to die, we have to die. Whether we use violence or nonviolence, we may not have, we have to die. But the issue is, what's the way to live? Better to live a short period of time in the way of God than to live a long period of time in the way of Satan. The fact is, this is what the Christian is called to do. Not to stand back and to do nothing in the face of evil, but to actively resist evil by bringing the power of Christ to it. Whether it is dealing with the children in the home, for Gandhi used to say, the home is the school for nonviolence, in the little conflicts with the children, or whether it's dealing with the far more critical and crises kinds of things of life. But one thing is for sure. If we do not bring to the little conflict with the children and the husband and the wife and the brother and the sister at home the Spirit of Christ, there is no possibility that we're going to bring it to the crisis situation. The choice, as Gandhi made the point, is not when war breaks out, I am nonviolent or I am a pacifist. Gandhi was quite clear. The one who becomes a pacifist at the moment when war breaks out is a fraud. He or she has been living the entire lifestyle that has created the war, and now they're going to back away from defending what they've been living off of. No. The commitment of Jesus Christ to nonviolent love is not a political tactic. It is a way of life, it is a mind style brought to every instance of life. It has power in the crisis situations, just like any other activity has power in a crisis situation, because you have nurtured it in the little things of life. Violence is the same way. One is competent in violence in the crisis situation because he or she has nurtured it in the smaller kinds of activities and disciplines that are necessary. So there is a choice, not about what to do in the crisis situation, that will follow. The choice is how to use the little moments of life, the little conflicts of life, how to respond to them. Whether to ask the question, what would Jesus do here? Or not ask the question and simply respond as culture says to respond. Jesus does not let and ask that we allow evil to run rampant. His whole life is dedicated to the concrete resistance of evil. But there is a choice of means that we resist evil with.